Hello again, this is Jerry Roberts, and we're picking up right now to start the second half of our course in cults, occult and folk religions. By now you should have already finished your first exam and finished up with the Jehovah's Witnesses and some of the introductory things about cults. This is always a major mental shift when you move from studying Jehovah's Witness to studying Mormonism. As a matter of fact, much of what you're going to see in this presentation was not my original research. It was actually research conducted by my wife. When we originally taught this course in the nation of Latvia, we had about 2 months to prepare before we needed to teach it the first time. And we quickly discovered that it was nearly impossible to keep studying about the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons simultaneously. Their teachings are so incredibly opposite of each other, so far apart from each other, that it almost makes you a little bit crazy trying to think of both of them at the same time. So my advice is be sure you finished up everything you have about the Jehovah's Witness. Make sure you've taken the exam. Make sure you have really good notes. Download the PowerPoint or whatever you want to. And now let's try to not think about the Jehovah's Witnesses right now, because Mormonism is an entirely different set of teachings, entirely different perspective on everything. So make your mental shift now. We're not talking about Jehovah's Witnesses and the Jehovah God and all this kind of stuff anymore. We're going into teaching and talking about Mormonism at this point. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to do a short history. And as I've mentioned this before, but I'll mention it again, these videos we try to keep them to 20, 25 minutes at the most, and therefore it is selected information. Now, this is going to be good information, but it's not going to cover every detail of everything about the history of Mormonism. If you have a desire to get deeply involved in studying Mormonism, read your textbook more thoroughly. There are lots of textbooks and other books available in your bibliography at the end of the syllabus. There are other connections that you could find, but this is just an introduction so you can get a feel where Mormonism came from and what its actual historical background is. Now, this is the narrative, this is the history. Do understand that if you're talking to a Mormon, A, they may not know the details of this history, and B, they will deny some of the details of the history because their history has been rewritten but within the religious group. This is the actual history written by outsiders, the history written by people who actually were alive during the time that these things took place. And so do understand that if you're talking to a Mormon, they may or may not believe everything that this particular history tells you, but this is the history that you would have found in magazines and newspapers. So the primary character in this story is a man by the name of Joseph Smith. He is the father of Mormonism. He is the founder of Mormonism. He is the reason that Mormonism exists. He was born in 1805, and he was born in Vermont. Because of a lot of financial problems, he had a very hectic upbringing. They moved around a lot. They moved to New Jersey, they moved to New York, and finally they settled in New York during the time. Very religious family, but understand the term religious meaning really the better term there would be very spiritualist. They believed in anything that was kind of spiritual. They did some stuff that they did attend a church on occasion, but they were really more into the things that were of the spiritual realm. And during the 1800s, it's kind of an unusual thing to be aware of. There was a lot of really interesting cult groups and a lot of interesting spiritualist groups during that. You'll notice that a lot of the groups we're studying in this course, their beginnings were in the 1800s. So the 1800s were a very interesting time religiously and for the development of cult groups and stuff like that. So anyway, that's kind of his background. Now, the interesting thing to know, by the people who knew him, Joseph Smith was known to be a stupendous liar. He was known to make things up all the time. He would always be involved in shady dealings. He got thrown to jail several occasions for running schemes. I mean, truly, he would have been a scam artist. If he was alive today, he would be out, trying to sell some sort of product that guaranteed hair growth, that type of a thing. So he was not just your everyday average run-of-the-mill guy. He was actually a person who was very aggressive in creating ideas, and he was especially known as a treasure hunter. He was known to be a person, if you had lost something, you could come to Joseph Smith And he had this special seer stone. It was some sort of magic rock, magic stone. He would put it in his hat, and then he'd put the hat over his face like this right here, and be looking into the darkness, into his seer stone, and it would help him to be able to find and know where this treasure was, or know where this thing that you lost was. And so he already had been practicing this idea of making money by finding lost things by looking into this seer stone in his hat. But now we're going to talk a little bit more about how did Mormonism actually begin. The problem is there are at least 9 different versions of this story. And if you start digging into Mormonism more deeply, you can actually find books that will show you the 9 different versions of the story that Smith told. But we're going to focus only on the official version, the version that would probably be more common in Mormonism today. But do understand that this is not the story the way that Smith told it the first time. This is the 8th or 9th time he told the story. He finally got all the details the way he wanted them. So basically around 1820, there was a huge revival taking place in New York, and during the time, supposedly, Joseph Smith said he became concerned about his spiritual well-being and went to the woods to pray for wisdom about which churches he should join and be a part of. And while he was there, praying in the woods as a young man, 2 beings appeared to him, and it was the Father and the Son. And this Father turned and said, "This is my beloved Son, hear him." And then Smith turned and asked these 2 beings, which of the churches, there's lots of churches that exist today, which of the churches should I join? And the answer that Jesus gave him, the Son, said, you should join none of these churches. All of these churches are an abomination. All of them are corrupt. None of them are teaching the true gospel. And so based on this idea, Mormons believe that God rejected all other churches, and that the Latter-day Saints, and you notice the term LDS listed throughout this. LDS is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. LDS is kind of the shortened way to say LDS movement. But based on this idea, based on the fact that the Son told him not to attend any other church, and that he had rejected all other churches, they believe that the Latter-day Saints Church is the only one true church, and they're the only ones who have the true gospel. And they also teach that Elohim, that's the name they have for the Father. Now, like I said, get Jehovah's Witness out of your brain. We're not talking about Jehovah God anymore. We're talking about the God called Elohim. All right? So, Elohim is the Father God, and Jesus are 2 totally separate gods, and they actually have physical bodies. So, based on Joseph Smith's vision that he reported here, they've got a couple of doctrines already that they believe in and such here. So, he claims then that a few years later that an angel appeared to him and told him to translate an ancient record hidden in a nearby hill. This angel's name was Moroni. Moroni. I don't know how he pronounced it because I've never heard a recording of him, but either Moroni or Moroni. According to Smith's story, Moroni was an angel, but he had been the last man to be alive to record the events of an ancient civilization that lived in the U.S., and he had hidden these records in a hill to be revealed in the last days. Now, the angel told him that each September 22nd, they're going to keep on meeting every year on September 22nd until God felt it was the right time for Smith to get and translate these records. So finally, 4 years later, in 1827, the angel told Smith it's time to get these records and take them from the hill and translate them. So the angel showed him where this historical record was, and he took it there and he dug it up. And what he dug up was this huge book made completely of gold. These big golden plates and kind of this big fold-over thing. And it was somehow this angel, this Moroni, when he had written this, he had written it on golden plates, and these golden plates had been preserved in this hill. And so this former treasure hunter finds these golden plates, and my first thought was, and he didn't sell them. Okay, if can you imagine how much gold that would be? He'd never have to work a day in his life from there on. That's more gold than most people ever see in their whole life. But anyway, I have a hard time staying on the subject because some of these stuff is just so crazy to me. But he took these golden plates home and he sat behind a curtain, and he once again, he had these special glasses, these special things called these rocks or stones or glasses that they're called the Urim and the Thummim, which, once again, the Urim and the Thummim are actually things that you'll find in the Old Testament. They actually were something that was supposedly the high priest had available to him and stuff. So he had the Urim and Thummim somehow. I guess the angel gave them to him. And using those, he was able to lay there and look through these stones, and it allowed him to translate these golden plates. And he would sit behind this curtain and translate the golden plates, and somebody would sit on the other side of the curtain and write down everything that he said. Now, these texts were supposedly written in a language called Reformed Egyptian, which, once again, is non-existent language. It doesn't exist, never has existed. And it was something he had to kind of make up, because anybody who was to check him, they would know he didn't know Egyptian, he didn't know Hebrew, he didn't know Greek, he didn't know any of these languages. So he had to create this other language that no one else would be able to read any better than he could. So using the Urim and Thummim, he translated the tablets. The translation of the tablets would appear before Smith's eyes. He ran the translation aloud. The scribe would write it down. And according to Smith, if the scribe made even one small mistake, then the translation would stay before his eyes, and he would read it out loud again until the error was corrected. Basically, it was all this supernatural process that made this a perfect translation. Now, based on this, the Mormons believe that the Book of Mormon is the most correct book on earth. In 1830, the writings that he put together were published, and they're called the Book of Mormon. Okay, the Book of Mormon. We'll talk about what the Book of Mormon is now. Just to note that there have been over 13,000 corrections made to the Book of Mormon in history. So this idea that it was the most correct book in history is ridiculous, and it is hard to substantiate. But they will still today say it was the most correct book in history, in the history of the world. But anyway, we'll talk about that again more later. Let's talk a little bit about what the Book of Mormon actually teaches and what it talks about. All right. Book of Mormon was originally written by the angel Moroni while he was still alive, while he was still a man. And so this was Moroni while he was still alive. The main character in the story was Moroni's father, Mormon. So it's the Book of Mormon because Mormon was the main character in the story. He was a prophet. He's the last leader of a group called the Nephites, and they were a group that lived in America called the Nephites. Now, once again, you have to understand the backstory here. Here's the backstory. The earliest people in America were the Jaredites. They had come to America around the time of the Tower of Babel, when the Tower of Babel took place long in history past. The languages were confused, and all the people went out in different directions. According to the Book of Mormon, there was a group called the Jaredites who left from the Tower of Babel and somehow found their way to the landmass that we now call North America. They built an amazing society, but after a while they had so many wars amongst themselves, they finally destroyed themselves completely after around 2,000 years. Now, we want to remember, there is no history, there's no evidence, there's no archaeology anywhere on the North American continent that shows that there was a group of people who ever existed in the United States, in the area that is now the United States of America at that time period. Just mention that in passing. But according to the Book of Mormon, around the end of the Jaredite society, there was another group that arrived in America. They were called the Nephites. The Nephites, according to the Book of Mormon, they were a group of Hebrews, a group of Jews, who left Jerusalem just before the Babylonian exile, and they sailed from the port there on the coast of Israel. They sailed and landed on the American landmass. And then this group called the Nephites arrived and settled and began their own society around the time of the Babylonian exile during the Old Testament period. Now, like I said, all the logic just breaks down so terribly here because this group called the Nephites were fair-skinned, beautiful people, which, by the way, if they were Jews, they would have been Middle Easterners. They would look more like Turkish or Arabian people at this point, but we won't go there. But some of them began to fall away and became apostate, and the ones that fell away and became apostate, God cursed them with dark skin. And they became dark-skinned people, and they were called the Lamanites. You had two guys. They had the Laman was Nephi's brother. The Nephi was the leader, and he made the Nephites. Laman was the other brother, and he got the dark-skinned guy, and he became the leader of the Lamanites. Okay. I know it's even hard to teach this. It is hard. It is so nonsensical that it's hard to teach it. And what's even harder to believe is there are millions of people walking the face of the earth right now who believe this. But anyway, all right. Nephi formed the Nephites. Laman formed the Lamanites. Now here's when it gets really interesting. After Jesus had lived in Israel for all those years, he walked on the earth. He had his disciples. He died. When he was resurrected, there was that period of time around 40 days after Jesus' resurrection when he made the appearances to the disciples and the apostles and all this kind of stuff. He wasn't with the disciples at all times, of course, during that time. He only was there at specific moments of that 40-day period. Their teaching of the Mormon Church, the teaching of the Latter-day Saints, is that during that 40-day period, Jesus also appeared to this group of people who were living on the American continent. He appeared to them, to the Lamanites and the Nephites in America, and he told them the gospel. And this is a real key verse for them. John 10:16, when Jesus said, I have other sheep that are not of this fold, they must also hear my words. Okay? John 10:16. And of course, a normal Bible translator, a person who's reading that passage and letting the Scripture interpret the Scripture, would clearly see that as just a kind of a prophetic statement about all of the Gentiles who were not part of the Jewish nation. It would be a pretty clear point. That's how we see it. Jesus was talking about the fact that the Gentiles were also going to be brought into the promise. But they take that passage, other sheep that are not of this fold, and they teach that he was talking about the Lamanites, and he was talking about this Jewish people group who had gone to the United States, to where America, the American continent. They had gone there, and he was going to go and reach them. So basically, Jesus shows up on the American continent, talks to the Nephites and the Lamanites, and they both accept his gospel, and they lived in peace and unity for some time. But then, once again, the Lamanites, they were the bad guys, and they began to fall away, and they started having war against the Nephites, and the evil Lamanites finally won the battle and destroyed the Nephites. And according to the Book of Mormon, the Lamanites then continued to degenerate and become worse and worse. And understand, they used to have these huge, beautiful buildings that looked like Rome. They had these huge society that looked like Rome, but they degenerated, and by the time the Europeans found them, 1,000 years later, they had degenerated into the tribes we call the American Indians. So the American Indians were, in fact, according to the Book of Mormon, the American Indians were a group of people who were Jews that had come to America, then got cursed with dark skin, and rebelled and accepted Jesus' gospel, then fell away, then killed the Nephites. So, all of this story was recorded on the golden tablets by Moroni. And Moroni, yes, he's the one who looks like the Viking in the picture. And yes, this is actually taken from Mormon literature. This is not a picture that I picked that's making fun of them. This is their picture. Somehow Moroni had Viking horns. Don't ask me how. Anyway, and I'm sorry, if you have friends that are Mormons, please understand that I'm not trying to belittle them. I struggle so much with some of this stuff, that how the enemy has come up with these teachings that are so deceptive that people will sit and believe them. It just troubles me sometimes, and it comes out as sarcasm. So forgive me if anybody feels offended by that. Anyway, but once again, that's him. His father Mormon is just died from the battle, and he was buried there. And then Moroni buries the tablets. And anyway, that's how their story goes. Now, any student of American history can show that none of this account is supported by any scientific data. There's no ruins of any of this ancient society. There's no evidence of a well-developed society. There's no evidence of buildings, no evidence of foundations. There's no evidence of any society that was previous to the tribes that we called American Indians. And genetic testing has proven that the indigenous people in America have no links whatsoever, either to Jewish or to the Babylonian heritage. they were clearly tied to the Asian people from Siberia. They actually have much more in common with today's Mongolians. Mongolians and the people in the eastern half of Russia are the kin to the American Indians. As a matter of fact, having served for quite some time in the area around Russia, it was amazing to me when I saw people from the Transcaucasus region, how often I would see a person say, wow, they almost look like they're a member of an American Indian tribe. They look like they could be Apache or Comanche, or they look like they could be, my great-grandfather was an American Indian. I said, man, that looks like the picture of my great-grandfather. And he was Cherokee. And so basically that's who the people group is. So nothing in American history, nothing in scientific data supports any of this story. All right? Now, I've already mentioned this, and I apologize that I used the wrong number. There have been over 4,000 corrections, not 13,000. I exaggerated. But there have been over 4,000 corrections to the Book of Mormon in the years. Some are simple changes in grammar and spelling. Some have been really significant changes, like the wrong name given to a location in the Bible. There are entire sections where Jesus was supposedly preaching to the Nephites that were taken word for word from the King James Bible. And the most interesting thing to me is there are also passages that the Nephites, supposedly Nephites, were quoting, and when they were talking, they quoted from the Old Testament. But the problem is this: the part of the Old Testament they're quoting comes from a section of the Old Testament that was written after the exile to Babylon. So it even messes with their historical timeline, because according to their historical timeline, these people left before the fall of Jerusalem and before the people were exiled to Babylon, and yet they're quoting a part of the Bible, a part of the Old Testament, that they would never have had access to because they left. And even if somehow they miraculously in their little tiny boats got across the Atlantic Ocean, I don't think somebody sailed across the Atlantic Ocean to bring them the rest of the Old Testament after the return to Jerusalem. So anyway, so as I said, totally no real reason at all to believe this story. But it is their story, and it is on the Book of Mormon that all the teachings we're going to talk about in later lectures are developed. It's based upon that. So another short narrative. I'm just going to run through this real quickly. There is a long story about the fact that they were persecuted. Mormons were persecuted. They were persecuted because they had a lot of weird practices, a lot of weird teachings. Also, their leader, Joseph Smith, actually was arrested, and he died as a martyr. He died with a gun in his hand in a shootout with a group of people. But anyway, they left, and they were persecuted. They were pushed from place to place, and they finally left, and they fled all the way across to what was at that point the American continent, and they fled to the area that became Utah. And there was a story that they tell, and this is another one of their great miracle stories. It's about the gulls, and there's a monument to the gulls. And in 1848, I'm sorry, that should be 1848. The Mormon spring crops were overrun with about, in 1948, we were finishing up World War II. Please forgive my poor PowerPoint there. That's horrible. 1848, they had made their way to Salt Lake City. Brigham Young was leading them at this point, and there was a huge blight of crickets that threatened them with starvation. There was this, what they prayed, and they said that the skies were darkened with these seagulls that flew in and killed all the crickets and saved the Mormon community. And they saw this was God's favor, and it was they said this was their promised land. Now the interesting thing is that this was not initially recognized as miraculous, but it took on the nature of miraculous later on. If you go to the Utah, you'll find the Seagull Monument. And the truth is that the seagulls come there on a regular, normal process, and they always eat the crickets, and they always regurgitate the parts that they can't swallow. And so, but anyway, just understand, they have their own history, they have their own stories that they tell that show that God especially has been providing for them, and God has especially been setting aside this land that they live in for them. Really, once again, the main focus we want to remember is they have their own narratives. Their narratives have no historical veracity to them whatsoever, but we have to understand where they're getting their history from so we can understand how it developed into the teachings we're going to look at as we do the next video. So, blessings. We'll talk to you next time.